Before we talk pricing, let's talk availability. At the beginning, the Ioniq 5 was only available in 10 states in the United States. That has now expanded to 17 states and is in the process of expanding to all 50 states in the United States. So although you may not be able to buy an Ioniq 5 wherever you are in the US right now, stay tuned. You should be able to buy it everywhere, probably sometime between the end of this year and early next year. Why is Hyundai doing that? Well, there are two logical reasons. The first one is that those 10 core states represent the vast majority of EV sales in the United States. The second one is limited availability. Every EV manufacturer in the world is struggling with capacity and the ability to build enough EVs, so by limiting the number of states where it's available helps ensure supply in those core states, but they are ramping things up. Now, the next thing to know is that the base model, the $39,950 SE trim, that is actually shipping right now, and they have made customer deliveries. The standard range version of the Ioniq 5 is the one that's effectively replacing the original Ioniq EV in America, the one that was shaped like a liftback or a sedan, whatever you wanted to call it. Now, the standard range model does have a few changes that are important to keep in mind. It doesn't get the 4-pin harness pre-wiring for trailering because it does not have a rated tow capacity. It also has less power, 168 horsepower versus 225 in the regular rear-wheel drive model. Range drops down to 220 miles in that model. It has the same onboard AC charger, but the peak charge rate drops down to 160 kW rather than 240, but it yields the same 10% to 80% charge time because the battery is smaller. And because the battery is smaller, it weighs less, about 280 pounds less. And it has the same tire size that we find in the extended range base trim. So handling may actually be a little bit better in that base model, but it's certainly going to be slower 0 to 60. I suspect most shoppers are going to want the extended range battery, and it's not a bad deal to upgrade into it because it's only $4,000 extra. From that point on, you can add all-wheel drive for an extra $3,500. Again, $3,500 is not really a bad deal when you take a look at what that includes. It doesn't just give you all-wheel drive, it gives you the extra power given to us by that extra motor. So power goes up to 320 horsepower in that model, and it is definitely way quicker. You also get the heat pump, which is going to reduce your energy consumption in the winter, and you get a battery heater. Now we should explain the battery heater in the eGMP platform vehicles. There is a bit of confusion about this. If you don't get all-wheel drive in your Ioniq 5, the vehicle can still heat the battery. It just does not have a dedicated battery heater mat in the battery compartment. So what the vehicle is going to do is it's going to use the cabin heater element to heat the fluid and then use that fluid to then heat the battery. It's going to take longer and it's not going to be quite as efficient apparently, but it will use the onboard heater to heat the battery pack. Just like the all-wheel drive model with the heat pump will also use the heat pump to help heat the battery. It won't just depend on that battery heater mat. But if you want the optimum battery temperature in really cold climates, that's when you're going to want that heater mat inside the battery tray. That's why it's included with the all-wheel drive model. So hopefully that helps folks out there that were confused. Next thing to know, absolute top-end version of the Ioniq 5 is going to be just over about $55,000 plus tax, title, license, and that destination charge. Now let's dive into comparisons. The first comparison I think has to be the non-Tesla in this segment, because if you've already decided not to buy a Tesla, then you're probably gravitating toward the number 3 electric vehicle in the United States right now, the Ford Mustang Mach-E. There's definitely a lot to like about the Ioniq 5 and the Mach-E, but they're certainly targeted at different shoppers. The Mach-E really comes across as a faithful Tesla emulation. I'm not just talking about the Mach-E's profile, which definitely is similar to the Model Y. I'm also talking about the way the Mach-E drives, specifically the ride quality. It has that same sort of firm and bouncy feel that we find in the Model 3 and in the Model Y. Definitely different than we find in the Ioniq 5 or some of the more expensive Teslas out there which have much better ride quality. Some of this has to do with the limited amount of suspension travel that we find in the Mach-E. It also has to do with the tires and the inflation choice and just the way the suspension was tuned generally. When it comes to cargo capacity, Ford is definitely the winner here. It has a larger cargo area in the back. It also has a fairly significant front trunk. In fact, the front trunk in the Ford is now one of the larger EV front trunks available in the United States. Handling falls below the Ioniq 5, however. Even, I would say, in the Mach-E GT versions, if you were to put comparable summer tires on the Ioniq 5. The Ioniq 5 is lighter. It has a considerably smaller battery pack. The battery pack in the Mach-E is absolutely enormous, and it is heavy, and then Ford puts relatively skinny tires on it. 225 width tires on most vehicles, just 245s on the very top-end Mach-E GT even the performance trim, whereas the Ioniq 5 in not a performance trim has 255 width tires on the top end all-wheel drive model. And when we finally see an Ioniq 5N, you can expect even wider, grippier tires on that model. When it comes to the software and route planning, Ford really wins the game here. It's absolutely no contest with route planning. We should talk about that first because it's something that Hyundai does not even do. If you want to take a road trip, say from San Francisco to Houston, Texas, the Mach-E will guide you to DC fast charging stations. It will automatically avoid fast charging stations that it knows do not work well with the Mach-E. So if something frequently goes wrong or if it's off and down, etc., it's not even going to bother guiding you there. It's going to take you to more reliable stations. The software also now recently, due to an update, will start taking into account things like the actual efficiency of previous Mach-Es that have been on that same journey. And the cloud-based system there that is pulling down info from all those other Mach-E owners is getting really, really accurate about estimating range. That's also something that we're going to see in the upcoming Ford F-150 Lightning. On the Hyundai and the Kia side of things, unfortunately, whether we're talking about the Ioniq 5 or the EV6, it will tell you you cannot reach your destination on a charge. It just won't really do anything about it. Now, very similar things are going on with the rest of the infotainment software. I like the layout of the Hyundai infotainment software better than the Ford's infotainment software, but Ford's is far more complete, far more adjustable, far more options going on in there, more frequent software updates, there are games in there that you can play while you're charging, etc. And I think that the entire ecosystem there is just a little bit better done for living in an EV, and certainly more Tesla-like. You can really see where Ford was getting their inspiration from. Now to the downsides. Good luck getting a Mach-E because they are all accounted for 2022. You may be able to find a dealer that has one hanging out on a lot. Be prepared to pay quite a bit over MSRP for that one, but you cannot order a 2022 Mach-E anymore. Order books will theoretically open for the 2023 model year at some point late in the 2022 calendar year. Next thing you should know, Mach-E definitely charges slower. Of course, I'm talking about DC fast charging because AC charging is pretty similar, but any way you slice it, you're going to gain mileage slower in the Mach-E because it's not as efficient as the Ioniq 5 in general terms. Now, it does have a long range because it has an enormous battery pack, and that really is one of the excellent things about the Mach-E. Range is very, very good, and if you get even the all-wheel drive model, you can get 280, 290 miles of real-world range without really trying too hard. That's more real-world range than you will definitely get in the Ioniq 5. But it's going to DC fast charge slower. So if you're on a road trip, that extra range you get might not actually make any difference because in the same amount of time it would take the Mach-E to go 10% to 80%, you could go 1% to 100% in the Ioniq 5. That's a really, really big difference. The last thing to know is that the Mach-E is going to be more expensive. It starts at $43,895 for the base model. That gets you more range, 27 miles more range. It also gets you more power, about 100 more horsepower, but slower charging, significantly slower charging than the Hyundai. Good luck finding that one, of course. Now, if you want the standard range all-wheel drive model, which is a thing in the Mach-E lineup, you'll get 224 miles of range, so pretty similar to what we find range-wise in the base Ioniq 5. If you want the extended range all-wheel drive model, which is going to give you more range than we find in the all-wheel drive version of the Ioniq 5, that's going to be pretty pricey. $57,800 is the minimum point of entry for that model. Now again, that is assuming, of course, that Ford maintains that pricing for 2023. Now let's talk about Tesla. The Model 3 starts at $39,640. That's the base model. That's going to be the closest corollary to the base version of the Ioniq 5, even though clearly they're not the same kind of vehicle. One's a sedan, one's a large hatchback. That will give you 267 miles of range, and you won't get a tax credit, so keep that in mind. If you do qualify for the full federal tax credit, the Ioniq 5 is going to be significantly less, around $32,450 because of that $7,500 credit. Now, for the Model Y, again, no tax credit, significantly more expensive, $62,990 for the base version of the Model Y. For most EV buyers, that is going to be at least $15,000 more than the most expensive version of the Ioniq 5. Because again, no tax credit. The bigger price tag on the Model Y does buy you greater availability. So if you want your EV sooner, the Tesla is probably going to be the best option. Also, if you want to avoid a dealer, the purchase process on a Tesla is absolutely excellent. That is one of my favorite parts of that. Now, you will find faster charging on the Ioniq 5. Now, actual peak charge rates may not be as high, but because it has a smaller battery pack and high efficiency, it will get you that 10% to 80% window faster. If you're going to the right supercharger station, the Model Y will peak at 255 kW versus about 240 for the Ioniq 5, but the Ioniq 5 will hang on to a higher average charge rate, a little bit longer in the window, and it also charges very, very rapidly, still above 80% and above 90%. So depending on exactly what you're doing, that may be an advantage or not. However, certain Model Ys will get you further on a charge. Now, Tesla's real-world range comes in definitely below their EPA score, but you will still find better range because the battery size and efficiency is definitely in a good position for the Model Y. As far as tech goes, it really depends on exactly what you're talking about when it comes to tech. We do have a real 360-degree camera system in the Hyundai. We also have a heads-up display, vehicle-to-load functionality, ventilated seats, and real blind spot monitoring, features that we don't find on the Tesla Model Y. I also think that the highway driving assistant is smoother in terms of its steering wheel interaction than Tesla's autopilot. Remember that both of these systems are hands-on-the-wheel steering assistant systems. Now, there is no promise of hands-free driving on the Ioniq. If you want that, you're only going to find that on the Tesla Model Y, but that is still a beta functionality product. Now let's talk about the Kia EV6, the brother from the same mother here. The EV6 is slightly spendier. It's definitely slightly sleeker as well. It doesn't have that sort of Volkswagen Golf from the 1980s vibe going on. It really looks like a futuristic wedge there instead. Efficiency is higher in the EV6 because of some of these design considerations. It has a shorter wheelbase, a longer rear overhang, a much more pinched greenhouse towards the rear, which results in less headroom to the side of your head in the back, and a slightly tighter cargo area in the rear. I kind of dig the look, but I do think the Ioniq 5 is more attractive. Now, we do have a long-term EV6 here at Alex and Autos, and the reason I bought it over the Ioniq 5 is because I could get my hands on it. I just could not get an Ioniq 5 for love nor money, so keep that part in mind. But if you're really torn between the two, I would say get whichever one you like the look of and whichever one you can actually get your hands on, because everything is very, very similar under the skin. We have the same sort of charging rates, the same electric motors, the same performance specs, very, very similar handling scores. Now, I have read a lot of reviews out there where people thought one handled better than the other and one felt different than the other, but having them together for a week back to back where I spent hours simply driving them back to back, parking lots, winding mountain roads, every situation you can think of to try and really determine exactly what the differences were. Honestly, there's really not much of one. 0 to 60 identical, 6 to 0 essentially identical, handling and steering feel incredibly similar as well. So really, it just is which style do you prefer. And that means it's time to talk about the Volkswagen ID4. The ID4 is an interesting option if you can find one. It does seem that Volkswagen has had a few production glitches with the ID4, and the factory in the United States in Chattanooga that they have been promising for a while doesn't appear to have actually produced any commercial ID4s yet. But supposedly it has officially come online, and we should expect to see those models coming to the United States here over the next few months. Now, the ID4 is pretty inexpensive. It starts at $41,230. There is only one battery. It's going to give you more range than the base version of the Ioniq 5, but it's going to give you kind of an interesting experience. The horsepower numbers seem higher than some of the competition, 201 horsepower in the base model, 295 in the dual motor model, but performance is not where you might think it should be based on those horsepower figures. That appears to be because Volkswagen is incredibly conservative with their battery pack. You will only get the quicker 0 to 60 times, which again are not that swift, if the battery pack is pretty darn charged. And as the battery pack discharges down to around 50% or so, you will notice a reduction in the 0 to 60 time. It just appears that they're very, very cautious with that battery. That's probably also why it charges much slower than the Ioniq 5. It has a peak charge rate about 100 kW less. Now that means that those charging sessions will definitely drag out compared to the EV6 and the Ioniq 5. They could take 2 to 3 times longer depending on exactly how much range you need to add to your battery. But on the other hand, Volkswagen is including 3 years of unlimited free DC fast charging on the Electrify America network. Basically what they're doing is they're allowing you a 30-minute charging session. It appears to be every hour or so. So you charge for 30 minutes, that session is free. You then unplug, drive to the next charger. Maybe you spend an hour driving, and then you can charge another 30-minute session for free. It doesn't mean you get to hang out there for hours and hours to get the battery absolutely completely full, although you could pay extra for that, of course. If you're looking for an EV that's very futuristic, go for the Ioniq 5. If you're looking for an EV that comes across as an electrified version of a regular crossover, then you're going to want the ID4. With a few limited exceptions on the inside, like the lack of rear window switches. You use the same 2 window switches for the front windows and the rear windows. Everything else about the ID4 experience is very normal crossover. The cargo area is very similarly shaped. It's not as wedge profile as we find in the average electric vehicle. It's a little bit more upright, a little bit more square, and it really does come across as an electrified Volkswagen crossover of some other description. Now, that could be good, that could be bad. The infotainment system does take you to DC fast charging stations, but it doesn't really do a very good job at it. Hopefully that's something that Volkswagen will be able to fix at some point in time. If you're interested in the ID4 but you want to spend a little bit less money, the rumor mill is telling us there should be a shorter range variant of the ID4 that will likely also have a bit less power. That's probably going to be on sale sometime in calendar year 2023. So if you're looking to spend perhaps $35,000 to $36,000 on your next EV rather than $42,000 to $50,000, you might want to consider that next ID4. I would not be surprised if it also included unlimited DC fast charging on the EA network for 3 years, just like we find in the bigger ID4, although again, no details on that just yet. At the moment, if you're looking for a solid electric vehicle in America and you don't want to pay Tesla money, you should absolutely have the Ioniq 5 on your shopping list, or the EV6, or honestly, the Genesis GV60. All these 3 vehicles are very closely related, and which one is right for you really is going to depend on whether you want the one with the luxury label on it and you like the looks of that one, whether you like the 1980s retro look of the Ioniq 5, which I do think is pretty sharp, or if you want the slightly wedgier, sportier look of the EV6 and the longer range and greater efficiency that goes along with it. You can't go wrong, however, with any of these 3 options. As always, there are a few unanswered questions. For instance, what is the battery life really going to be like, and will frequent DC fast charging decrease your battery life more or less than we find in modern Teslas? I would expect it to be substantially similar, but we really won't know for a number of years yet. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section. And what would you be interested in if you had maybe about $45,000 to $48,000 to spend on your next EV? I would say, as long as you qualified for some of the tax credit, would you be considering something like a Tesla Model 3 because it's the known quantity and has the safety of that supercharger network? Or would you be willing to branch out and explore something like an Ioniq 5 or an EV6? Let me know down there. Check out the merch store, hit the subscribe button, find me over at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all those other social places, and I'll see all of you next week.